So welcome everybody to our Scope 18 on matrix training and miniature linguistic system. Janine, do you want to jump in and just go over the CE real quick before we introduce our speaker?
Absolutely. Thank you so much,
Thank
Sophie.
you.
So I am the CEU coordinator for SPABA. And if you would like CEUs for tonight's presentation, then either keep your camera on throughout the duration of the presentation, or if you email me, and I have put my email in the chat, I will email you back with just a few multiple choice questions to answer so that we can do our due diligence. If you are a member of SPABA, then you may receive 2 CEUs annually for free. If you are not a member of SPABA, you may join today and we'll give you credit for the presentation and give you a free CEO. It's just $20 per year. It's a great value. And if you do not plan to become a member, but you would still like CEUs for today's presentation, then you may go online onto the SPABA website and you may pay $10 for the CEU, and then I will in turn email you the certificate. Give me about 48 hours to get you the certificate. And then last piece of information is at the end, I need some type of feedback. So you may put it in the chat and I will record it there. Or if you'd prefer to reach out to me privately with feedback, feel welcome to use that email, my name, Janine Shapiro, the number 3 @gmail.com. That's in the chat. And go ahead, Sophie. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janine. So again, welcome to everybody. I think we had a couple people just entering the room. So tonight we are happy to be hosting Dr. Sarah Frampton, who's going to be presenting to us on matrix training and the miniature linguistic system. Dr. Frampton is an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha in the psychology department. She teaches in the Applied Behavior Analysis Master's Program, jointly administered with the Monroe-Meyer Institute. Before accepting a faculty position, Sarah had served in leadership roles in organizations providing ABA services across the country, including the May Institute and the Marcus Autism Center. Her research interests include interventions related to teaching new skills to learners with and without disabilities. She has published research across the major behavior analysis focused journals and frequently serves as a guest reviewer. Sarah's service has extended to membership on the editorial boards of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in Practice, and the Analysis of Verbal Behavior. She was recognized with student research grants from 3 special interest groups within the Association for Behavior Analysis International, the Award for Excellence in Behavior Analytic Research from Simmons University, and the Researcher of the Year Award from the Language and Learning Clinic at Marcus Autism Center. So we're excited to learn from you tonight, and I will go ahead and pass it over to you, Dr. Frampton. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, and I should definitely mention that one of those groups that supported my research as a student was this wonderful group. I'm so thankful that y'all have been a part of my research career from, the very early on. So it's an honor to be here and give back in any possible way to this group of amazing clinicians and practitioners and doctoral level big picture thinkers. So again, thank you for having me tonight. And my goal tonight is to talk about matrix training, obviously, also known as miniature linguistic systems. But I think, as you'll see in my presentation, I have some very specific reasons that I call it matrix training, mostly for the jokes. So that's going to be my preferred terminology as we go. But I also want to start the presentation by just recognizing I will be talking about work that is not exclusively my own, but work that I've conducted alongside numerous wonderful colleagues, including a very talented speech and language pathologist, Dr. Paul Simeone. So we're going to get started tonight by talking about art. So what if I told you that you had a task and that was to recreate this painting? I think for most of us, that's going to be a really complex task. Like, where would you even start? Like, would you go to the store and try to buy like 50 paint colors and match them up exactly to every hue that you see in the example? Maybe you would then kind of get your canvas and start copying like one corner exactly, like kind of match it exactly corner to corner until you get everything right in that spot. Then you move to the next spot and you copy that spot and so on until you're done. Well, I am not an expert in painting, but I can certainly tell you that if you did that, it would literally be the least efficient, most expensive, and time-consuming way to approach this very complex task. And I think that would become immediately clear to you as soon as I said, great job, now do this one. Well, back to the paint store you go, because you have to get completely new colors to recreate this painting. You're also going to have to get your new canvas, start in the corner and copy, 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 copy to end up replicating that new painting style. So in the case of that complex task, would it not be just so much more efficient in the long run to buy paint colors and then buy black and white and like actually just learn how to mix? You could also then study actual painting techniques so that over time you might develop skills that aren't just useful to you when you're copying when painting, but could give you the skills so you could paint anything that you dreamed of. And so if you did not already catch my drift, the paintings are a type of complex, rich, beautiful language performance that we want to establish with our patients, our students, and our children. And those paint choices and techniques, well, those are the skills our learners need to achieve those types of performances. And so, of course, that wasteful, just rote way of painting, that's what I see when we focus too much on teaching to content and not enough on teaching to cusps. So I will talk tonight about a line of research that, again, I'm very passionate about because it can accelerate learning for individuals in our care by establishing those cusp skills. So I will describe the key steps of a matrix training approach and talk about the role of stimulus control within that approach, because we're behavior analysts and we always want to know, how did it happen? And then I'm going to talk through some resources that might help you troubleshoot if you are applying this approach and maybe not seeing the results that we all dream about, because I hope that anyone that is unfamiliar with this research might feel equipped to use it in their practice after tonight. So this is my son, Liam. He's a hoot. When he was about this age, he toddled in and he handed me one of his little cuddlies. It was a stuffed flamingo. And he said to me, "Mama, flamingo eat poop." And I looked down, it said flamingo, and unfortunately what he said was entirely accurate. Like, he had somehow brought that flamingo into contact with poop. I think his, but to be honest, I'm not sure. So in that moment, I was understandably very surprised by what was all over my hands, but also surprised by just the complete novelty of that utterance. Like, I can tell you with certainty he had never, ever, ever said that again, and thankfully has never, ever said it since. And again, that sentence was perfectly accurate in that it corresponded exactly with all the relevant environmental variables. And ultimately, when we think about that for a little bitty kid, that is a complex performance. And so the question is, how did he learn to do that? So one potential explanation is that, of course, Liam was demonstrating what has been described as recombinative generalization. And in their seminal article, Goldstein and Musetis describe recombinative generalization as the process of producing or responding to novel utterances when familiar stimuli are recombined in novel ways. So essentially, having learned each element of that utterance under distinct sources of stimulus control, Liam was able to emit a novel utterance, now consisting of a combination of those elements. In typically developing infants and children, it just seems to happen, like kind of magical around 26 to 36 months. And certainly, when we see performances of that type, I think it fits very well with the description of a behavioral cusp, as it permits the expression of new personally stimulating ideas and observations like flamingos eating poop. But we do know that in the autism population, achievement of that cusp can't simply be assumed based on age alone. On some very broad measures, research suggests that 65 to 75% of children diagnosed with autism present to moderate to severe delays in speech production. Again, these are not statistics I think anyone in this group is unfamiliar with and probably know much more intimately than I do, actually. But I know one that has always jumped out to me is that for some children, that delay to first words might be not occurring until even 38 months, which is when we would already expect children to be combining words into those same types of flexible phrases. I'm also betting that folks in this group are quite familiar with the Verbal Behavior Milestones Assessment and Placement Program, or VB-MAP. And as such, you're probably quite familiar with two of the milestones that really connect very directly to recombinative generalization, TACT Milestone 9 and Listener Milestone 9, described here. And so this is the part of the talk where I fess up to just practices that I really regret and things that when I look back, I'm like, oh, I can't believe I was doing it that way. You know, years ago, as a practicing BCBA, I was serving a lot of patients that had trouble meeting those criteria. I mean, 50 is a lot of TACs and it's a lot of listener behaviors. And I was doing my best to try to teach those skills in like fun and functional ways, like, you know, hey, let's roll the car, shake the bell, drink the cup, open the book, hug the bear, all those kind of things. Because again, I really wanted to fill in that milestone grid and I really wanted these kids to meet those goals. But as in reflecting on that programming, I just, again, really began to notice that things were off. And ultimately, of course, with that way of teaching, and you might imagine there's really no end in sight, you know, like we just had to keep finding new nouns and new verbs to teach over and over and over. And as the list of targets get long, the piles of materials get larger. And then once you teach all these weird targets, we had to work on maintaining them somehow once they were taught. And truly, I mean, once you're in the 20s and 30s of these unconnected random noun verb combinations, I just have to say the degree of relevance to the learner was getting really hard to justify. Like, how does one tap a fork? Like, why does that help? You know, like just some of the combos were just completely, utterly meaningless, and had no potential for real future impact on their lives. And so, again, by the very definition of recombinative generalization, I was also reflecting that we don't need ones we've taught. We need novel responses. We need these noun verb responses to occur that have never been explicitly taught, like my son and his flamingo. And so the approach I was taking was really not getting us there and definitely not anytime quickly. And again, ultimately in my assessment, the way I was programming, of course, represents that rote, rigid way of programming that is unlikely to result in flexible generative learning, which is ultimately what we want to see in children and certainly what Dr. Sundberg intended with those milestones. And so to complete my analogy, I would suggest that I was kind of more teaching that child to paint by number instead of teaching them to paint. And so to solve that problem, we entered the matrix, which is, of course, why I have to stick with that terminology. It's just too fun. Now, matrix training has nothing to do with Keanu Reeves, sadly, but it does have everything to do with how we arrange and we order our targets for instruction. And to be clear, matrix training itself is kind of a misnomer because it's not a standalone procedure. It's just an element of a treatment package. And it's really just the part at the very beginning when you're determining what you will teach and in what order. So in this matrix training approach, if we're dealing with, say, a two-dimensional matrix, we would take those components of a complex skill and arrange them on two axes. Now, within the matrix, each target consists of a combination of those components. Now, we certainly could teach each one of those things one at a time, but again, to me, that's equivalent to buying those 50 paint colors instead of just your primaries. You know, we want to teach mixing. We don't want to have to teach all of these if we don't have to, and we want to make sure that as an end result of the intervention, this individual is producing more flexible and generative utterances, ideally so they can communicate what's personally relevant and meaningful to them. Now, within the matrix training literature, there are a couple of approaches for ordering instruction. One is called the non-overlap, also known as diagonal training approach. Now, in this non-overlap approach, the targets down the diagonal of the matrix are selected for training. Collectively, these 3 targets include 1 exemplar of each component skill. And, so far from what the research suggests, this approach seems more optimal when the component skills themselves have already been mastered. So those may be tax for duck, rabbit, and pig, and tax for reading, painting, and sitting. Perhaps those have already been mastered. And all this individual needs to learn is how those responses should be combined. Now, the second main approach is called overlap training, also known as stepwise training. Now, in this approach, 2 cells per row and column might be targeted. As a result, each component is taught with 2 other components. And this approach certainly involves training a few more combinations, as you can see, but it can potentially lead to correct responding even when those component skills have not yet been mastered. So there may be some additional efficiency gained in this approach. Now, certainly in addition to considerations related to doing that overlap or non-overlap overlap approach in training, we have variations in which the order of targets and as they are presented in the training. So this is an example matrix developed by Hatzenbuehler et al. In which they targeted play actions with children with autism. In this study, the authors trained all the targets simultaneously, meaning all 4 of these targets were in intervention at the same time. Fun note on these targets, though, to complete each of these target responses, it actually included selecting the correct character, putting them in the correct location in a play castle, making them do a target action, and having them emit a corresponding vocalization. So again, these are some pretty complex responses that these children are learning within this context of matrix training, and I think a beautiful example of a really creative approach to programming. Now, certainly depending on the content area and the size of the matrix you're training, and then taking into account a learner's discrimination skills, simultaneous training may be too much. And so you might consider adopting a sequential training approach, as was applied by Curiel et al. In this study. Here, the authors are training money skills to typically developing preschoolers. So they began by training the children to assemble $1.01 and $1.05 when they were given an array of currency choices. Now, you might immediately recognize this is also an example of that overlap training because there are 2 targets being taught that relate to that dollar component. And you might also recognize this is a pretty nice way to build in discriminations right from the beginning of training with that different dollar amounts. Now, once we see independence with these amounts, the authors began instruction on $5.05 and $5.10. Again, we have that overlap with that nickel amount interacting with both the dollar and the $5 bill. And then, of course, once these targets are mastered, they introduce training for all 4 targets. And then we add in our next group of targets with the $10.10 and $10.25. And then ultimately mix all of these targets together. So this sequential approach allows for more targets to be introduced just a bit more systematically, and can promote some really nice, strong discriminations, even with fairly difficult learning content. Now, matrix training is one of those areas of research that happily has been applied across a really broad spectrum of content areas. So we have examples from play, from academics, from functional skills, and lots in kind of a general area of like linguistic skills. And I think these are, of course, fantastic and useful content areas that could be applicable to a lot of learners. And we have 3 reviews of this literature, all within the same kind of span of years, which is also kind of unique. And again, if this is an area of interest, I certainly would recommend all of these reviews as they each bring something a little bit differently. I do want to highlight that work by Dr. Paul Simeone, whose co-authors on that paper included Dr. Ralph Schlosser and Dr. Howard Chain. I felt a little out of place and underqualified to be on that review, but it was a pleasure to be invited and to contribute to it. And so that paper in particular, I think, brings a really nice lens from experts in speech and language pathology, which is exciting. And again, I think a really nice demonstration of what a great intersection of our disciplines that are possible within this matrix literature. Now, given that there is a ton of research on matrix training, I selfishly am going to just talk about studies that I've been a part of. And it feels weird to do that, but the reason I choose to do it is I know those studies well, so I feel more comfortable making direct recommendations for how they might be adopted in practice. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of my first foray into this matrix literature, which started in 2016 when I, again, was a BCBA working directly with kids that were on my caseload while I was working at Marcus Autism Center. With these patients, again, they had VB-MAP goals for those TACT milestone 9, listener milestone 9. We were doing clinical treatment to try to meet those goals. And we applied a single subject design and got reasonable data, which was exciting. So in this study, these are the matrices that we developed. The nouns are displayed on the rows and the verbs are on the columns, just like that earlier example I walked through. Now, for these children, those nouns and verbs had previously been mastered in the context of their clinical programming. So we chose to do that non-overlap approach where we just teach the diagonal targets. Ultimately, again, we had seen pretty continued evidence of acquiring these nouns and verbs in isolation wasn't leading to the recombinative generalization. So the stage was pretty set for conducting this intervention to see if we could establish that critical cusp. So we assigned some of these nouns and verbs to what we called matrix 1, and then we assigned other mastered nouns and verbs to the generalization matrix. So our baseline was pretty simple. We just probed all the combinations for both matrices, just little 9 trial sessions. In these sessions, the instructor, who was one of my supervisees, would pick up the little 3D figurine, act out a little action, typically with some kind of accessory items. And I like to point out that we absolutely did not use 2D pictures. That is a question I get asked a lot. And, I have personally tried to find 2D images that could work really well for matrix training, and I found it very challenging to find like the same or similar characters or animals doing these same kind of set of actions. I had some luck at one point with like SpongeBob and I think Mickey Mouse. There were a lot of images available for that, but I found it was very, very time consuming. And yet in every single clinic or classroom I've ever consulted in, there's always little 3D figurine animals and little like play foods somewhere in the room. And so I have just ultimately found it's really fast to just use those 3D things. I also think there's a more direct connection to maybe play skills, which could then serve as an ongoing kind of maintenance context. So in my own practice and experience, I endorse those 3D figurines, I guess, is what I'm ultimately saying. So we picked up those little 3D figurines, made them do a thing. We asked what's happening. And then we did not provide any differential consequences in baseline. We would just acknowledge the responses. We then use our typical clinical procedures to teach those 3 non-overlapping TACs. Our approach reflected procedures established by Sundberg and Partington in their manual, so including transfer trials and space trials to check for conditional discriminations. And we did that because that's how we taught every other thing in our clinic. And I like to just make note of that because there are plenty of procedures that might be applied within matrix training as those reviews suggest. So as long as it's an efficacious procedure and you has established that it works for this particular client, I don't think there's any reason to think that you have to use this approach. I just certainly like it and continue to use it in my own practice. Now, in the post-test, we just repeated the probes that we did initially in baseline. We always probed matrix 1 first, and then we would probe the generalization matrix. Now, what we were interested in seeing ultimately is if training with those non-diagonal targets in matrix 1, would those be omitted? And then certainly the other targets within the generalization matrix. Ideally, training of the diagonal targets would establish recombinative generalization in matrix 1, and then responses within that generalization matrix, for which we train no targets in that matrix at all. And so for correct responding to occur in that matrix, to us would really indicate that some type of shift, some type of cusp had been achieved that even goes beyond the context of training. So let me orient you to our graphs. In our baseline, we evaluated, of course, the diagonal targets from matrix 1, which are shown in our black circles. The non-diagonal targets are shown with the open diamonds, and then the generalization matrix targets are shown in those blacked diamonds. So, we see few to no correct responses in baseline. We start training those diagonal targets. You'll notice they were mastered pretty quickly. It's just 3 targets. We were presenting them each 3 times per session. We're moving pretty fast here. And then we get to the probes. And not only do we see recombinative generalization for the non-diagonal targets in matrix 1, we also see that responding in the generalization matrix. And again, I just like to really reiterate, we didn't train a thing from that generalization matrix, and yet we see correct responding consistently across these 4 participants. So that was certainly very exciting that you train 3 targets, and we have an additional 15 that are mastered as a result of that training. But of course, it did not work perfectly for all participants. One young man who was on my caseload, he was a 16-year-old who presented with similar VB-MAP skills as those other younger participants. Well, he didn't acquire the targets from the generalization matrix. And on this graph, we're displaying only those diamond data paths. So he demonstrated recombinative generalization in matrix 1, no problem, but we didn't see that overall change in repertoire like we saw with the younger children. So we didn't give up. We just built another matrix, matrix 2. We repeated that same overlap training, probe for recombinative generalization in matrix 2, and probe again in the gen matrix. We had kind of a blip in improvement, but then returned to 0 levels. So we did it again. We developed matrix 3, and thankfully this one was the trick that, again, we have 3 demonstrations now of recombinative generalization within training matrices, and following training across matrices, we now have that change in the generalization matrix performance. So what I like to point out is that even though like the graphs might make it seem like, oh, that was a lot, we actually just trained 9 things. Like we trained 9 targets, and then 27 additional targets were demonstrated by this 16-year-old with autism. So I think that's pretty exciting to know that this technology can be applied to even learners that have more impacted repertoires. So again, just to summarize that math there, that we taught 3 tact responses for 4 of our participants and established a total of 18. And then for Jaleel, we had to train 9, but we established 36 total. And that is, of course, by far more efficient than the way I had been practicing before with those lists of crazy unrelated targets. It also addressed that limitation of allowing us to focus on demonstrations with novel targets that had never been performed. And again, I think this is a shift towards that teaching towards cusps. So we're not so much focusing on the particular content in isolation, but shifting our attention toward teaching to a behavioral cusp. Now that's just, of course, one study demonstrating this approach, and I want to show a few more. Of course, I have really benefited from getting to consult closely with wonderful speech and language pathologists and work in a setting with experts in verbal behavior that we welcome and integrate speech generating devices in every single verbal behavior intervention we possibly can. I'm a big fan of this review by Tinkani and colleagues where they took a look at some of the literature on use of SGDs and interpret it from a verbal behavior lens, which I love. And in this review, they noted that we need a lot more research on how SGDs might be used to teach more complex verbal operants, and particularly verbal operants other than manding, though of course manding is super critical. And one thing that my colleague Dr. Vidisha Maria really pointed out to me is that, well, for an SGD user, most responses are quite complex. Even something like a tact for a noun and a verb requires a ton of hits on the device. So you might have to open the app, navigate to the things folder, then we have to find the animals folder, and then we have to find the dog, and then we have to hit the home button, go all the way back to the actions folder. Then we select the action, hit the top bar, produce that utterance. Whew, I mean, that is a ton of steps with the potential for control by a lot of different variables. And so when I think about that, that's a lot of opportunities for stimulus control to get a little bit wonky and certainly a little bit rote for some of our learners. And so thankfully, when we are in need of procedures that produce strong stimulus control and result in flexible generative learning, we can always go back to the matrix, which is what Dr. Maria did. So my colleague took our 2016 study and basically just replicated it exactly with children with autism that used speech generating devices. The trials were presented in nearly an identical manner. So engaging in that little action with a figurine, asking what's happening. And then of course, the primary difference is responses were evaluated on the device. And as you might imagine in baseline, there was a lot of noun tacting that happened pretty consistently across participants. So in our baseline session, no correct responses for either Bruce or Mason. Again, lots of noun tacting, but not noun verb tacting, which was necessary for us to code it as a correct response. Training proceeded very quickly for our SGD users. I mean, really in about the same span of sessions as our vocal communicators, which I think was great. Again, like the vocal communicators, they had mastered those noun and verb targets in isolation before we began this. So all we had to focus on was teaching those 3 diagonal targets. In the post-test, we have recombinative generalization for matrix 1. And again, we replicated the effect with the generalization matrix target. So really a direct replication of the effects using the same procedures with just some minor adjustments to ensure that we are including those responses on the speech generating devices. And like the 2016 paper, it didn't work the same way for all of our participants. A third participant, also an older teen, did not demonstrate correct responding in the gen matrix, despite all the strong performance with the non-diagonal targets. So in this graph, we can see the performance on matrix 1 elevated, and then the gen matrix performance is, right in that, 0 right there. So we developed matrix 2, and we see the same effect. We have recombinative generalization within matrix 2, but no effect on the targets in the generalization matrix. We do matrix 3, same thing. At this point, we were wondering if potentially the targets we had trained hadn't maintained with discrimination. So we, did a little maintenance check. In fact, some of the targets from matrix 1, 2, and 3 hadn't maintained. So we taught those 3 diagonal targets for each matrix again. And still there's no improvement in the gen matrix. So for this kiddo, it was matrix 4. That was our winner. And so we see not only recombinative generalization in matrix 4, but we also see finally elevated correct responding in the gen matrix. But again, I like to point out, we trained 12 things, training 12 things and established 33 additional combinations. So in this one protocol alone, we basically hit milestone 9 on the VB map. So still pretty efficient and allowed us to move systematically evaluating all these critical cusps. Now, again, I think this is a pretty efficient way to program, but we can be even a little more efficient if we include 2 generalization matrices. So these are some data that we published in 2019 where we were looking at color shape text with children with autism that were vocal communicators. In these matrices, we have colors on rows, shapes in columns. And as promised, we created 2 gen matrices. And again, did this for a couple reasons. First, we're greedy. We want as much for free responding as we can get. And we had also learned pretty strongly from our prior endeavors that it might take more than 1 matrix before we see those effects in the gen matrix. So it seemed wise to just kind of have an on-deck extra matrix that we could incorporate in teaching if we needed to use that training across matrices approach. So with these participants, we again started with making sure that these colors and shapes were mastered in isolation. Then we randomly assigned the matrices and their order to different participants. So in this study, matrix 1 was not the same for each participant. It was different for each one to just make sure that the colors in one matrix weren't particularly easy than another, or the shapes, etc. So here's our baseline. Again, a few differences just to note in how we designed this baseline condition. We have those 2 gen matrices, so we've added that square data path filled in black. And then we also did not have kind of a set sequence to the probes. We had them randomly alternate. Again, we did that just to kind of make sure that there wasn't some controlling effect of maybe the sequence of training, that we wanted to see if we mixed it up, would there be no detraction from the correct responding. So just a little change in how the data look. So we trained those 3 diagonal targets, which are shown in gray, mastered quickly. We repeat our probes. And for Oscar, Stefan, and Carl, we see correct responding in all 3 matrices right away. So that's 3 targets trained, 24 additional, and we were able to do a maintenance evaluation. So after 2 weeks, we saw correct responding sustain at high levels without any additional practice. But of course, with Wayne, George, and Tony, we see something different. We saw inconsistent responding with even the targets that we trained, and then certainly inconsistent responding with non-diagonal targets. And overall, responding was variable, but not great overall in the gen matrices. Now, ultimately, if the things that we are training aren't maintaining, well, we need to train those again. So we went back to training just those 3 diagonal targets. It actually took about as long as it did in the first round of training. So we, repeated that series of training, reach mastery levels, repeat our probes. And for George and Tony, huge improvement, correct responding across matrices. For Wayne, we saw some improvement in one generalization matrix, but not the other, which I thought was really interesting. This study had been supported by a small grant, so we kind of were out of time and out of money. So unfortunately, we didn't get to kind of further dig into that issue with Wayne to understand, like, why not that matrix? But overall, we did see improvement with that tactic. So ultimately, I think, that's a sampling of the data available in matrix training, suggesting it can be both efficient and flexible. Essentially, we train those diagonals, we get a lot of correct responding to those combinations. And even if we have to train across matrices, it's still more efficient than training each target separately. And again, I'm always happy to report that we see similar results with our vocal communicators as our SGD users. And I love seeing that correct responding that we see with young children might also be achieved with older individuals. And that this can be adapted across content areas. So I think these are a lot of characteristics that suggest to me that this matrix training approach can be really useful in practice, because we always need things that work well and work quickly. But as we know, those aren't the only characteristics that matter. I like to point out that matrix training procedures are really adaptable. I spent like almost no time at all describing how we trained exactly how we probed, because we trained how we trained everything else. Like, we just used our standard organizational procedures. And again, the probes that we conducted, well, they were almost nearly identical to our standard organizational probe procedures. And so I think that that is a really big advantage of this particular intervention, that the effects come from the planning. They come from the part at the beginning where you're sitting down and really mapping out instruction. And then you can link up the effective instructional practices that have already been established with that child and that patient to that planning. And again, I think that this is a really important characteristic, because if you work for a large organization, or you are a consultant serving a patient or collaborating with a teacher, you may not be able to change the company handbook. You may not be able to go in and change, hey, let's completely alter the teaching strategies that we use here. That may not be within your purview, or it just may not even be possible. But I think when we effectively train or plan, this intervention can still have some big impacts for our learners. So I think that's a good thing. So my hope is that you're feeling interested in applying a matrix training approach. And so I wanted to shift gears and kind of share some recommendations about how we might take things that have been demonstrated in the literature and put them into practice. Again, a lot of these thoughts really came from my time at the May Institute, working with just tons and tons of teachers, tons and tons of BCBAs, and trying to disseminate evidence-based practices. And what I really learned in my time there, as Dr. Whalen might agree with, is we can't shift practices by just handing people articles. It literally never works. You cannot just hand articles and hope that things change. And so my goal with this tutorial is working together with Dr. Judah Axe to try to come up with, yes, an article, but an article with resources and suggestions that could be really mapped into typical organizational practices. So hopefully, though, it's still another tool, another piece of paper. Our goal was that within this tutorial that we published last year, there would be some guides and tools that would help to bridge that gap even just a little bit more. So what I'd like to do now is maybe talk about a few of the things in that paper that I think might be particularly relevant. So in that paper, we listed out some major considerations that are really designed that, a practitioner, whether that's an SLP, a teacher, or a BCBA, just might think through when they're trying to design their matrix. And so certainly the first thing we have to think about is what's the curricular area. And again, it's such a broad literature. No one should, I think, feel particularly limited by like, well, we've only seen studies evaluating colors and shapes, so we can only do that. No, there's tons and tons of articles and ways that matrix training can be adapted and applied. But one of the key requirements is that the components, so those things on the axes of the matrix, well, those components need to make up the compounds or composites within the matrix. And those components, therefore, must be controlled by unique environmental stimuli. And so ultimately, if we think about Curiel and colleagues did a great matrix training study where they taught adults with developmental disabilities to tack times on a clock. Well, when you tack time, the hour response is controlled by the hour stimulus. The minute response is controlled by the minute stimulus. So that would work really nicely in a matrix. We can put hours on one axis, minutes on the other. But let's say the response firefighter. Well, the responses fire and fighter aren't controlled by distinct components of a firefighter stimulus. That single stimulus should evoke both responses as a single unit. So firefighter couldn't be broken out on the axes of a matrix. It could be a target within a matrix, like a firefighter could be doing all kinds of good things and putting out fires and rescuing kitties from trees and what have you. So a firefighter could be a component, but it could not be one of those composite skills on the inside of the matrix. Another thing we like to ask ourselves is, of course, should these components be flexibly recombined? If we have picking up and pushing and throwing as component skills, well, we can throw a ball. Probably shouldn't throw a cup though, and we definitely shouldn't throw a stapler. And so these combinations don't really work together well. And so there's definitely some planning and consideration that needs to go into making sure that those composite skills on the inside would all make sense, I guess, and interact well together. Now in the tutorial are these exact matrices, which we didn't design like in thinking this is the only way it should be done, but more just as examples that maybe could be easily adopted and changed by anyone that wanted to. So these are noun verb targets. I mean, those could be presented as tact or listener. We have preposition, object, just various examples of matrices that theoretically work based on those particular considerations. So again, our thought was that we could include these and then folks could just easily swap out, hey, my client really loves raccoons, so I'm going to get rid of that cat target, replace it with raccoon, and then we're off to the races. We've got our matrix ready to go. Now, one other consideration when you're looking at your curricular area, to me, I'm really into like the nitty gritty of protocols because I've run a lot of them and I've made so many mistakes, I guess, but I really like to think through like the practicality, like what are the materials we're going to use, because with matrix training, that number increases exponentially. And so every time you add a component to your matrix just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so if we look at that, think about that preposition object matrix. I mean, that's going to be a lot of pictures that you're going to have to make. And of course, they need to be laminated and then stored and then replaced, which of course they're going to be lost. And so certainly I think it's ideal when we can use materials that are within the individual's environment. And frankly, I just think there are targets for which 2D pictures do not do justice to the key components. So for example, I mean, again, these are pictures I have made and put in VB map kits. I regret it. I really wish we had just always used objects or use things that the child was more familiar with. So again, I think using those actual objects, putting a ball inside of a box or inside of a cup or on top of or next to potentially might have a different effect for some learners, and certainly depending on their developmental levels, different considerations. I also personally advocate against, with the pictures of actions, jumping always looks like flying or floating. So I think, we want to think about these things as well. you know, at one point we were getting a project going which was really emphasizing videos, videos that could be recycled and reused across clients, so that once we had these nice videos, we didn't have to keep remaking them. So again, I just think this is something that we shouldn't neglect, just the practical considerations, because sometimes this is the difference between a protocol actually being used and run well and not. Now, I'm only showing this crazy cube matrix here. We have some examples of three-dimensional matrices in the literature, but they've been less frequent. I think pretty immediately they're a bit overwhelming, but wanted to demonstrate that it's possible. Certainly the majority of the literature has focused on two-dimensional matrices, but this could be a really exciting area for future research, and would certainly potentially only increase the efficiency of the approach if we added that third dimension. Now, when thinking about designing our matrices, I think this choice about how many components to include is a really big one and a bit nuanced. You know, I started this presentation saying we have to teach to cusps, but I don't think that means we should ignore content. Not at all. We just have to know which to focus on and when. And so, you know, when we need to teach to content, like when the content itself is important and meaningful for that learner, well, then like all the combinations are going to be pretty relevant, right? Like a client cannot be said to have mastered time telling if they can only tell time on 15-minute intervals. That's not mastery of how to tell time. Same with money. So again, content, when we're teaching to content, because it's going to be meaningful for that learner, that means we might have larger matrices. So we might have to make some different types of choices, maybe think about that sequential training instead of simultaneous training. But if we're teaching to a cusp, we may only need a subset of targets because we're really looking for that recombinative generalization, and maybe the particular content isn't our primary emphasis. And so that's consistent with the tactics I shared in the studies I presented on today. Now, I actually like to live in a world where can we not have both? Like maybe we start by teaching to that cusp. So we only start with a subset of combinations, and then we just keep growing our matrix and filling it out to make sure that we've addressed all the critical content areas. Now, I think additional fun considerations within matrix training is, well, how do we get even more efficiency? And how do we leverage the stimulus control that we're establishing to, you know, build even more critical skills for our learners? So certainly Goldstein and Musetis in one of their seminal articles demonstrated beautifully that we actually might be able to teach in one operant, say listener or tact, and then probe in the other, consistent with what we would now more consistently refer to as bidirectional naming. So teaching in one operant, we should also probe in the other, which would be very exciting. We also have numerous demonstrations from studies where we can probe across instructors, across materials, across contexts. So there are, in addition to using a generalization matrix, I think even more ways that we can produce robust, flexible, generative repertoires and address a number of different content areas within this intervention. Now, I, you know, kind of walked through these big considerations of, are we using the non-overlap or the overlap training at the beginning? Again, what so far my best deduction is, and what our literature reviews seem to suggest, is that it really seems to come down to the status of the components of the matrices. So those skills on the axes, are they already mastered or are they not? And so when you're using known component skills, you're likely only going to need that non-overlap or diagonal approach shown with light gray. If those component skills are unknown, then potentially some additional training and training with more exemplars might be necessary, consistent with that overlap approach. And so again, so far, that seems to be our leading recommendation. And I know that some great researchers like Dr. Samantha Bergman are pursuing questions like that. So I think we're going to continue to see more findings in this area, which is exciting. I referenced this already. I won't it's a lot to look at. And this is actually an area a student and I are talking about is kind of how do we sequence matrix training in a way that is not completely overwhelming for learners, particularly when we want to tackle some of those larger matrices. You know, so one suggestion that I think is really nicely exemplified in the Axon Sonato 2011 study is the use of sub-matrices. So we can take this big 6x6 matrix and chop it up into these little sub-matrices. And when we use this sub-matrix approach, we can use some combination of both sequential and simultaneous training. And I think it might be a more efficient way, or maybe less overwhelming, might actually be the right word, less overwhelming way of proceeding through training. So potentially with this approach, you might start by simultaneously training these diagonal targets. And then when mastered, we can probe for recombinative generalization within just that submatrix. We could then teach just one additional, potentially, combination here, probe for recombinative generalization, teach another, and so on and so forth. So by kind of subdividing your matrices, you might be able to cover a lot of content, but still introduce training in a thoughtful way, taking into consideration all those good conditional discriminations that we want to establish with our learners. Oh, working backwards, wrong direction. Here we go. Okay. Now, certainly, as promised, and as exemplified in our the research studies I shared, things don't always go according to plan. And so one of the resources that we wanted to provide was a bit of a backwards design analysis about, hey, let's think about the end in mind. Let's begin with the end, and then think about what would you do depending on the results that you obtain. And so certainly, these are some outcomes that have been demonstrated in the literature, and I know for myself in practice have encountered pretty regularly. And so if we see that, hey, we did our diagonal training, or we did our non-overlap training, and responding is below mastery level for all targets still. Well, that suggests that what we did didn't really work. And so there's really two avenues that I think you could pursue if you do training and nothing happens. Well, first, you might try the training again, because if you were seeing correct responding in training, you go to probes and responding deteriorates, as we saw in our 2019 study, you might need to go back to training and just strengthen those relations again before you repeat your probe. You also might determine that your probe condition isn't working well for this learner. And so in the examples I gave, we used non-differential reinforcement. We just gave acknowledgement to the participants. That may not be the right fit for a lot of our learners. And in fact, if you look at some of the response patterns in that 2019 paper, see pretty distinctive extinction curves. We have responding start off strong in the initial probes, and then it just appears to extinguish for some of those participants. And so in those cases, that non-differential consequence may not be the right fit. You might need to introduce contingent reinforcement for correct responding. And again, in practice, that is what I do. I also like to be clear about that in the research, sometimes we've made choices based on what other researchers have done. But in practice, I use contingent reinforcement in all phases, because I'm using it as a skill acquisition intervention with clinical patients, and it would be counter-therapeutic to not reinforce. So again, I just like to point out that there might be things in the research that may not be a good fit for practice, and I think that lack of contingent reinforcement is a big one. And so point being, if you do your probes and it doesn't look good, maybe think about, is there something about the probe conditions that could be modified to suit the learner? Now, if you get the outcome where, hey, correct responding is below mastery level for only untrained targets, but it's sustaining for the targets that you trained. Well, that's somewhat good news, and then it means that your training worked. The things that you set out to train, those responses are sustaining under probe conditions, which also suggests that your probe conditions are able to sustain correct responding. So that's good. We've made progress if this is our outcome. Now, if we see this, my suggestion would be to train overlapping targets or edge targets. So basically train more targets within the same matrix. So if you started with that non-overlap approach, you might switch to the overlap approach. If you started with the overlap approach, you might even pick some of those just remaining targets in the matrix. That might get you to see some of that recombinative generalization. Now, if you see responding below mastery level for the generalization matrix, if you had one, I think our study pretty nicely exemplified, you could just potentially train across matrices, and eventually you may see that result occur, as it did for both our adolescent participants. then happily and hopefully we see correct responding at mastery levels across matrices. That's the fun outcome. That's the one we love if we can get that one. At that point, this is when some of those fun considerations might come to mind, like maybe you can probe in a different operant. Maybe you can probe in a new context or with a new instructor, or evaluate responding in a more play-based setting, so on and so forth. Now, this last little bit I wanted to share involves a bit more technology, but when I was at the May Institute, one of my jobs was to create and manage our shared program library that we kept in Central Reach. So we built a bunch of matrices in Central Reach. So in that program library, for noun, verb, color, shape, two-step actions, time, money, all of them had matrices built in. And we did that by just making sure that the first 3 targets that would appear were always those diagonal targets. And then the next 6 would be recombinations of those initial 3 targets. Now, this is an example pulled from some IEP data. A teacher presented just the targets in Central Reach as they appeared in Central Reach. No idea that she was using matrix training. She just trained the first 2 targets as they appeared in the program bank. And then the way we had Central Reach set up is it would pull in new targets into baseline, and the targets were just mastered in baseline. Magically, right? Somehow magically mastered in baseline. Well, and then the program would pull in the next 3 targets, which were the diagonals for a second matrix. Well, one of those was mastered, but the other 2 required some training. Again, then in baseline, the remaining targets were mastered without requiring intervention. So I really always get excited about these data because we essentially replicated the result of our carefully controlled JABA study, just using Central Reach, using a great teacher, using her paraeducator, and without even really knowing they were doing matrix training, they achieved matrix training. So I feel like that's a pretty good endorsement that this is something we can translate into practice with some good planning. Now, just in closing, I wanted to tie a few pieces together. If we come back to our painting analogy, by teaching cusps like recombinative generalization, I think we really are breaking free from that color by number ABA, and we're essentially giving those paintbrushes back to our learners. And armed with that increasingly rich verbal behavior repertoire, they can teach us and others what they are interested in and what they care about. And as their interests shift, we can just shift our programming. We can align our programming with those interests, keep powering them with more vocabulary so that they're able to talk with us what they want to tell us. And with that mutually responsive process, I think it keeps us on a pathway of just lifelong discovery with our patients. And we just are going to continue to give them more effective ways to talk about the things that they care about. And ultimately, that's what we all want to do. And that's what we set out to do in the first place, which is help our patients live those best, happiest lives. Ending with acknowledgement of the wonderful collaborators that were an active part of all of these research studies. Again, I always like to think of the people that are not here when I have the opportunity to present, because their work was integral for having any of these data to talk about today. And then last piano joke, I hope that matrix training is not a problem for you and you feel empowered to use this technology. And certainly if you have any questions at all about matrix training, I am nerdily happy to talk about it at just like any time. And I'm also happy to share any articles or additional resources that might be of benefit to this community. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out. But that is all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frampton. I've been following the chat comments, and I think everybody is really excited about what you've shared with us tonight. And it sounds like a lot of people are really impressed by your work and look forward to trying this out themselves. So yeah, thank you so much. I don't feel like we don't always walk away with things that we're ready to kind of get going with right away. I think Dr. Frampton, if you had said you'd be available for some questions, if anybody has any. I don't think I saw any in the chat, but thank you for staying for a couple minutes. If anybody looks like we have one raised hand at least. Corey, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks, Sarah. That was awesome. I've heard you talk about matrix training in the past, but I think I learned something new every time, which is just kind of a testament, I think, to your dissemination skills.
Thanks,
I guess I've been thinking about a lot about this in the context of task analyses and chaining together responses that might not land in the verbal behavior world, but sometimes I feel like I write task analyses that have a lot of similar steps or almost repeated steps, but you have to train. I still train each step, and I'm wondering if you've ever thought about how to apply matrix training to some other type of response or some chain of behaviors that might lend itself to it, and if you have any thoughts on that. I can't even think of a good example, but I just feel like I've done that and struggled,
I have a thought, and again, this may not be what you're thinking, but I have thought about this a little bit from the lens of problem solving. And again, may not be exactly what you're thinking about, but I know I had this clinical patient so long ago, and we were doing this procedure where we would introduce some type of a problem, like poor kid, I would like accidentally rip his art project, and then we'd be like, we have not, what do we do? Oh no. And we'd emote very dramatically to see if he would respond to that. And then we had tape available, we had glue available, we had a stapler available. And at one point, we trained one of those responses. How about we get tape? And we'd get tape and we'd fix his little project. And then he had previously learned that like glue is for sticking, staplers are for sticking. So he had some of these, related skills. And what we were curious to see if now in a context where the tape is not available, would he select an alternative way of sticking things together? And so I've wondered about that a little bit, kind of within some context related to, especially like ADLs or kind of daily living skills, vocational training tasks that potentially we should not be training, that the only way to make cereal is to find the bowl in one place. The bowls might also be in the dishwasher. They might also be in the sink. So introducing planful variations, I think could be introduced using some aspects of matrix training. I think it's a little bit different than purely recombinative generalization. I think it would have different underlying mechanisms for effectiveness, but perhaps not. I mean, certainly in that case, in a problem-solving analysis, they would stem from the MO, that like we have some kind of conditioned establishing operation that is evoking that behavior. So it would be different, but that's the thing I've thought about. I don't know if that's
no, that's kind of exactly what I was thinking. We've done it in the clinic before for play skills, right? So like you always play like the cups are in the kitchen, but it's time to play kitchen, but the cups are missing. So they have to problem solve and figure out it reminds me a little bit of that. And I feel like potentially the driver is more maybe some extinction induced variability, right? Like there's no cup available, so you got to find something else. But it feels similar. So I don't know, we can talk about it later, but I'm curious about that. So thanks.
Yeah, and I always like to, when I can credit, Dr. Chada Dixon was presenting at a conference on using a matrix designed to teach play skills or greeting skills and again, it wasn't for the purposes of promoting recombinative generalization per se, but it was for the purposes of making sure that training was being done systematically across different environments with different people. So I think you could do a social skill program where you're teaching a combination of greetings like, hello, how are you? And then interacting with different names. So certainly I think you could use matrix training to do something like that. But I think it also could just be a good way to think through how are we going to promote generality for whatever skill that we're focusing on.
Thank you. Dr. Frampton, we have one question also in the chat. Would you talk more about teaching in one operant and then generalizing to another?
All day, every day. No, I love talking about bidirectional naming, another one of my favorite topics. So I certainly won't try to ramble on too far. But in my experiences, if a learner has those prerequisite skills that generally seem supportive of demonstrating naming, so some stronger echoics, good orienting skills, established auditory visual conditional discriminations already, no particular barriers there, no particular barriers acquiring tax. If we have those component skills intact, I think if you look for it, you're probably going to find some type of, emergence across operants. Now, I think that depending on the skills that might be harder or easier, if you are doing prepositions like, hey, put this next to the cup, inside the cup, that's a motor response that the listener is doing, and the tact response isn't the same. It's not quite as kind of evenly bidirectional in a way. Like they're very different types of response forms, I think. So if I think it might be a little more problematic there. But if you're doing something that, you know, tacting a color shape combination, I think we could expect to see emergence as a listener skill if we taught it as a tact. And again, the literature in this area would strongly urge an emphasis on tact training. It is much more likely to produce the listener response than the alternative, particularly with children with autism or impaired, you know, language repertoires of any kind. So I've also found that sometimes, you know, I have done actually some of that color shape work with patients, and they actually demonstrated the color shape conditional discriminations. They could find the red star and the red circle and the blue star and the blue circle. They simply could not tact them. So that might also just be something to look for, as they might demonstrate a stronger response in the listener repertoire, and it just may not have yet emerged in the tact repertoire.
And it looks like we've got a little bit of a follow-up here in the chat.
yeah.
Was the SD what's happening already conditioned to evoke agent action? Did you get any non-target semantic relations like eating apple instead of dog eating?
Great question. We had never incorporated that instruction into programming, so it was a blank. I say blank slate. It was a verbal SD that had not previously. Well, it was not an SD. It was just a verbal stimulus that we chose specifically because they had no particular reinforcement history with that instruction, and so specifically that was what we wanted to choose, because what is it? Was already evoking a noun response. Typically, what are they doing? It was evoking that verb response. So we tried to pick something different for that. And, you know, one thing that I keep chewing on, and I've kind of put it in a couple papers on direct instruction, but I mean, listen, direct instruction language for learning does this better than I've ever done this or will ever do this. And I think when we kind of look at the components of how they build that beautiful autoclitic frame of the I am touching my, I mean, they're doing matrix training on a whole other level, really. Like, I think if we were to map out the matrix there, it'd be enormous, but they have those really beautifully conditioned, consistent verbal SDs that then do take on that conditioning history with novel responses. So to me, that's the example that I look at and love and think about often.
Yeah, we were trying to use the verbal SD, what's happening across different semantic relations. And so then it was like, it was when we were looking at a third matrix that we didn't actually have to use, that it could have been confusing because we were looking for action plus the object that you're performing it on. And so then I was just thinking about whether or not, like, how important that was. You said, like, in some of the studies that you ran, like the learners already had been taught agent plus action, probably using what's happening as an SD or something similar, or tell me all about this, or tell me what you see, you know, something that would signal they should evoke a multi-word combination. So just curious. I mean,
yeah, I think it is so tricky because, you know, that to me, the entire reason that we see correct responding in the generalization matrix is that we established what's happening as discriminative for that, you know, noun, verb, color, shape, response. And, you know, at one point, who did that? One of our editor AEs, I think, really challenged us on, like, hey, is that responding in the generalization matrix even recombinative generalization by definition? And we were like, technically no, because we actually didn't teach them to recombine those. And so, you know, I look at some of those responses and I think a lot about Dr. Dave Palmer's work on atomic repertoires, that I think that, you know, within matrix training, we're just teaching stimulus control at the most molecular level. So I think that's certainly a component of it. And then, you know, I was looking at some Skinner 57 yesterday and revisiting some sections where he talks about relational autoclitics, that in, you know, English language, our nouns tend to occasion verbs based on our, like, the verbal community and the history of conditioning. And so I think there's some autoclitic business happening also in matrix training that, that then to your initial question, what SD we pick matters because it's going to really then occasion that relational autoclitic. So maybe we even, anyway, I think that there's some relationship there that's important and underexplored.
Thanks.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions. If you have another couple of minutes, Dr. Frampton. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you think it's better to use a larger matrix with submatrices for one semantic relationship, e.g. agent and action, or teach smaller matrices across multiple semantic relations, such as agent and action, action and locative, action and object?
Ooh. Man, that is a beautiful empirical question, and I would but I think that would be an incredible research study, and I think, again, reminds me of some of what we see in direct instruction, in that, the dog, initially is presented in one context, and then the dog is being presented as running, and then the dog is being presented as wet, and then, so I think that would be a lovely thing to isolate and study. That's all I got. Great
But it's hard.
Yeah, it would be hard. That one would be hard to study.
That's right. That's right. But it's this like blocking versus, generalization problem. And I think it's interesting.
No, I think it's fascinating. And maybe perhaps just a demonstration of like what that might look like, because I think that would be so instructive. You could almost imagine it as a matrix that just keeps having new axes and new dimensions. And almost like an unfolded Rubik's Cube, because not every component would interact with every other one potentially. I don't know. I think it could be really, really cool. And I would love to figure out how we could study it. Maybe we could do it as a translational study of some kind with like nonsense stimuli with adolescents or with adult participants. I have undergrads. You could make them do all kinds of things. Let me know if you want to figure that out.
Right. And in DI, they give you a very specific SD that's actually tacting part of the relationship. Yes. So they'll say, tell me everything about what the dog is doing, or tell me the whole thing about what the dog is doing.
Yes.
So the dog is eating an apple while standing on the roof,
Which reminds me a bit of some of Francesca Degli Espinosa's work of having learners echo part of the, include that autoclitic as part of their response. I feel like there's some kind of interaction between all of this that would be good to explore.
To follow up with that, though, when we experimentally kind of evaluate things, what is your recommendation to bridge this research practice gap? For example, if we're using extinction, or maybe we have a really thin schedule of reinforcement because we are monitoring both the trained and untrained relations, and then we're, making kind of a thin schedule of reinforcement. How, without publishing a tutorial every time that I do a study, which awesome, thank you for doing that. But without doing that, how can we approach this problem where we're training future clinicians to embrace being a scientist practitioner and replicating the research, empirically supported treatment, and be like, highlight, like giant sign, we did this as an experimental control, but like, please don't do this because it's therapeutically contraindicated. But I couldn't do it. I could not isolate the variables without doing it this way, but please don't do that.
Yeah. Oh man, what a great question. And I think, something I would love to see, editors of journals starting to incorporate into articles, and, BAP at some point has included things like that, and have, when submitting to certain journals, often there is a stronger push for like, what are the implications for practice? So I think that's certainly a component of it. I think I have been having this particular conversation about contingent reinforcement in a few contexts and getting pushback. Corey's nodding because he and I have had this conversation like a ton of times too, particularly about contingent reinforcement. And I wonder, there's that one great article by Linda, I think Linda LeBlanc's 2003 paper, Kyle Miguel's on it. I can't remember the author order, but they look at 3 different reinforcement arrangements and studying equivalence outcomes. And so there has been some work on this, but that's maybe one of the only ones. So I think more research would be really helpful to just maybe tease apart or suggest alternative ways of data analysis. When we're studying skills that are emerging, well, the first time that they happen, that's not a product of the reinforcement contingency of the probe because that response wasn't reinforced yet. And so if we're going to use contingent reinforcement, maybe we just need to use a different method of data analysis. Like we should look at the first trial responses because every response that occurs after that could be attributed to the reinforcement contingency. So, but again, who cares? The first one that happens is the most important one, in my opinion. And when we're trying to produce these complex texts, complex interverbals that emerge from other sources of training, well, of course I want to reinforce it. So I don't know, maybe that's just what we need to do. Yes, that's right. Maybe we need to just articulate that somewhere and propose it as an alternative method of data analysis. Because I will say, when I have tried to trace back some of the history of why can't we reinforce in probes? Like why? There's not a great answer. And again, Corey and I have talked about this. And I think a lot of it actually stems from the basic translational work, enormous contributions from those lines of research, but not intended for use with children with limited language repertoire. So maybe just somebody has to stand up and say it. Dr. Einar Ingvarson is really good about advocating for this. He talks about it in his presentations. He's been doing it for a decade, actually. Like, he actually poked me about it in one talk, like literally called me out on it, but in a friendly, like nice way of like, hey, like, why can't we reinforce? And I was like, oh, I think we should. So I don't think we're alone in that particular concern. And I think the class of concerns I think is shared. Anyway, that's all
Sarah,
I got.
just to add on to that, I'm just
Great.
sort of finishing up a study that is a comparative design. So it's an adapted alternating treatment design with a control condition, not on matrix training at all. But speaking of contingently reinforcing during probes, we did decide to contingently reinforce during probes for the exact reason that you brought up, as the fear of extinction. Problem is, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Oh, absolutely.
Because what happened was, for a variety of reasons, we used arbitrary stimuli. So there was no way they could, for example, generalize matching or something like that.
Sure.
One of the participants learned during the probe sessions for
Sure.
control conditions. So
Oh, yeah. They're clever.
Yeah, he just happened to be particularly clever and learned the stimuli during the control condition because of that contingent reinforcement. So, this random response he emitted got reinforced, and all of a sudden was like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, So it is tricky because I don't feel like there is a good solution. You either have the threat of learning during the probes, or you have the threat of extinction. But for practical reasons, like you said, it doesn't matter. That's
Sure.
just for experimental control reasons. Yeah. For practical reasons, you want them to learn during probes if they can. So yeah. Really interesting.
Yeah. Was it a listener response or like any
it was a device response, so an AAC response. So it was a conditional discrimination, essentially. And we used, because of a previous study that I had done, we used completely arbitrary symbols. And so it wasn't like he was generalizing matching and understood that this random symbol meant sock, for example.
Yeah.
But he had increases during the control condition. And
Interesting.
the only relevant explanation would be that he learned through that contingent reinforcement.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that makes your study cooler.
Well.
Yeah.
I've seen it as well, and things that, never left the laptop screen because of those types of issues that come up, for sure.
But I think it needs to leave the laptop screen.
Yeah.
I think it does. I think it's important. I mean, we had 3 different participants who responded very differently. similar to what you had. So you had
Yeah.
a whole bunch of participants with similar skill sets, and yet, you know, most of them, I mean, 2 of them responded in predicted ways, but still different from one another.
Sure.
And then there's this one participant who
Always
responded
one.
very differently. But I think that kind of stuff needs to leave your laptop.
Well, and I think that might be also, maybe there needs to be some strategic recruitment of reviewers. I mean, that's always an option when we submit our work, is to request particular reviewers that might be able to appreciate that nuanced discussion. And so, I mean, that maybe that's a way that we can kind of,
I know.
that's all
It's
I got,
hard.
you know, 'cause
It's hard because of
I know.
yeah.
I agree though. And again, when we, Danny Conine and I, in a recent review of emergent intraverbals, when we like had we were trying to make some bolder statements about contingent reinforcement, and we definitely got pushback editorially about like, can you support that recommendation? How are you supporting it? So again, I think there's work to be done. Maybe in some of the basic and translational space, because I think that's what it's there for, is to help us get to the bottom of some of these things. You know, one way I have thought about approaching this as well is if we can demonstrate that there's a really serious decrement in responding when we make one of these counter therapeutic choices, like if it messes with an undergraduate student when we do X, don't we think that logically that means it's really potentially interfering with learners with substantially more impairment? So I don't know. I think maybe there's some other ways we can kind of get at this point. But yeah, I agree. It's important.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. This is so fun.
This is great.
I don't want to keep everybody on if you don't want to be on, but I did have a question. So those participants who don't necessarily respond as predicted are always the ones that are interesting to me.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, as you said, no matter what, matrix training was more efficient, right? Like even if you had to retrain the generalization matrix, you were still more efficient than if you had to retrain all the responses. But do you have any speculation about those particular? I know what you essentially did was, you know, I don't know what the best term is, but what we would consider multiple exemplar training.
Yeah,
like
I agree.
You just retrained until you got it. But do you have any speculation about why those particular participants might have responded slower? Because I feel like that can, 1, either help us to predict it, or 2, help us to offset it if we want to make it more rapid.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the best answer I can give is Dr. Dave Palmer's answer, which is, I think just has to do with the precision and the degree of stimulus control that we are establishing. And so it seems to me that learners that are demonstrating recombinative generalization, there's still some potential for control by the presence of the stimulus itself, even if they have not learned to tact the red heart. They have tacted a color, they have emitted a color shaped tact in the presence of red and in the presence of hearts. And so I think there's still some supportive aspect, facilitative aspect, something that's strengthening the stimulus control for that combined response. And again, some of that Skinnerian relational autoclitic business also comes into play, that if I've said red and then a shape, it seems likely that I could say red, and then instead of saying the shape I've been trained to shape or to say, I could substitute in the frame a new shape, but that red has been followed by shape during training number of times. Whereas if blue was in the generalization matrix, blue has never been followed by a shape. And so that relational autoclitic originating with the color may not evoke the shape component.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Oh, great. I mean, I had to pull that one out to figure
No,
that out.
It makes perfect sense though. It really does.
We tried a number of years ago, Dr. Schillingsberg and I, to do a study where what we did is we, after diagonal training, would go straight into the generalization matrix probe. This is a study somebody should do. I've been like meaning to do it for 10 years and like we never got enough data or enough data with IOA, which would be the problem in clinical practice. Like we had the data, just not clinical practice. Yeah, so go right from diagonal training to Gen Matrix Probe. Because if that works, you went right from training 3 on targets that aren't connected to each other to doing a Gen Probe for completely unrelated targets to what you just trained. That's multiple exemplar training all the way. That's not even matrix training. You can't even call that matrix training. That's just multiple exemplar training.
Right.
Train 3 tacks, probe a bunch of different combinations. For some kids, I think that's going to work. And it did. What we did find though, for some kids, it did not. So we would train those 3 targets, probe the Gen Matrix, no correct responses. Then we probed the training matrix, got recombinative generalization, repeated the probe for the Gen Matrix. All of a sudden we have correct responding. So that sequence of experiencing responding to those recombined targets seemed to set up success with the Gen Matrix in an interesting way for some kids. So again, that's where when we were trying to present those data, we were, trying to dig into why might that be possible. All I could think of was the relational autoclinics might have something to do with it. But again, I think those are some questions that could still be answered about like, why does this work for some kids and not others? For some kids, matrix training isn't even necessary. Multiple exemplar training is going to just knock this out. So I think there's like some kind of continuum of stimulus control that's maybe playing out across learners that, again, we don't have a good handle on. Like, as much as I adore the VB map, it's not enough to tell us this and predictively give us this answer, because all of the kiddos in those studies had similar VB map milestones. The difference was their age. So
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. It really does. Thank you.
yeah, again, somebody should do that study. It'd be real fun. It was fun. It was really quick too. Of all the studies, like that one was very fast. But
Thank you, Dr. Frampton. It sounds like a few projects may come out of this discussion tonight, which I love. I'm going to pass it over to Janine, who has a just CE reminder for anybody who is collecting those tonight.
Okay, I just put my email one more time into the chat. If you have not left feedback within the chat and you'd prefer to email it to me, please do so. This is only if you are seeking CEUs, and feel welcome to reach out to me with any questions regarding CEUs. You don't get them automatically. You had to have requested them by emailing me prior, but it's not too late. Again, you're welcome to email me now, and if you're a member, you get 2 free. Otherwise, you're welcome to go onto our website and just pay for them there. And then I will subsequently email you your CEU. Thank you so much for joining us.
oh, it was my pleasure. Anytime. This is such a fun group to chat with.